what sobering, got that. What sobering times are in, and I'm looking forward to what the Rabbi has to share with us, particularly in the context of all that's going on at the moment. So, welcome, Rabbi. Looking forward to what you're sharing with us today.
Yeah, thank you. I really think you hit the nail on the head. And we're really going to draw a lot of parallels of what happened on Kristallnacht, and actually what happened on that horrific day in Israel on October the 7th. Look, I must share with you on a personal level, I'm a child of a Holocaust survivor. My father was in the death camps and miraculously survived. And whilst like most survivors, he didn't speak about it, but the Holocaust, the suffering was always there. He had on his left hand the letters KL, very large letters, signifying that he was in the camp, a concentration lager. And from time to time, he broke down for no reason, screams at night. As I was growing up, obviously, I read about the Holocaust and understood what went on there. But he did in his later years, he shared a little bit of the horror with my own children, his grandchildren. But I grew up with the words "never again." This would never happen again to the Jewish people. And unfortunately, for one day in Israel, the most secure place for Jews, ostensibly, it did happen. It was an all-out pogrom against the Jewish people. Obviously, it's different today. We've got an army, and please God, the Israeli army should be successful, and the hostages should come out safely. But that day is a game changer. It's a game changer. Certainly in Israel, there's going to be a lot of soul searching as to what happened and to why it happened. But for many Jews around the world, what it has also brought out is the latent anti-Semitism that was there has been brought to the surface. And no matter what happens, even when this war is concluded, I believe the genie has come out of the bottle once again. And many Jews around the world are reflecting what their future holds in their country of residence. I mean, thank God here in Australia, matters had to be contained, but not just last week. I saw a Jewish member of parliament saying the following words: "I've got a son in the IDF and I've got a daughter on a subway going to university with a Star of David. To be frank with you, I'm more worried about my daughter than I'm worried about my son in the IDF." I mean, that's what's going on there in London. And you've seen the footage. So let's just look at now with our eyes as to those events that occurred on November 9th in 1938 and sort of draw a number of parallels and similarities. What comes out very starkly, as you'll see, are the number of interviews that I'm going to share with you of survivors, and they always conclude, but it's chilling, but this will never happen again. Unfortunately, they were wrong. They were wrong. So let me begin with just a quick short overview of what happened then.
Kristallnacht or the Night of Broken Glass, was the wave of violent anti-Jewish pogroms on November 9th and 10th of 1938. It took place throughout Germany, annexed Austria, and in areas of Czechoslovakia recently occupied by German troops. Kristallnacht owes its name to the shards of shattered glass from the windows of synagogues, homes, and Jewish-owned businesses that lined German streets in the wake of the pogrom. On November 7, 1938, Ernst von Rath, a German embassy official stationed in Paris, was assassinated by Herschel Grimspan, a 17-year-old Polish Jew living illegally in Paris. Grimspan revengefully shot the diplomat after witnessing the expulsion of not only his parents, but thousands of Jews of Polish citizenship living in the German Reich. Von Rath died on November 9, 1938. The same day, at a meeting of Nazi Party leadership, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, the chief instigator of the Kristallnacht pogroms, suggested that world Jewry had conspired to commit the assassination and ordered that any demonstration while not organized by the Nazi Party shall not be hampered. Newspapers reported otherwise. After Goebbels' speech, violence erupted in various parts of the Reich. Paramilitary, or SA, and Hitler Youth units throughout Germany and its annexed territories destroyed Jewish-owned homes and businesses. Jewish artifacts were confiscated, and many young, healthy Jewish men were arrested and filled local jails. The rioters destroyed 267 synagogues throughout Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. Many synagogues burned throughout the night in full view of public and of local firefighters who had received orders to intervene only to prevent flames from spreading to nearby buildings. SA and Hitler Youth members shattered shop windows of an estimated 7,500 Jewish-owned commercial establishments and looted their wares. Jewish cemeteries became a particular object of desecration in many regions. Mobs of SA men roamed the streets, attacking Jews in their houses and forcing Jews they encountered to perform acts of public humiliation. Kristallnacht claimed the lives of at least 91 Jews. As the pogrom spread, units of the SS and Gestapo, the secret state police, arrested up to 30,000 Jewish males and transferred most of them from local prisons to Dachau and Buchenwald, as well as other concentration camps. In the immediate aftermath of the pogrom, measures were introduced to eliminate Jews and perceived Jewish influence from the German economic sphere. The German government announced that the Jews were to blame for the pogrom, imposing a fine of $400 million on the German Jewish community. German education officials expelled Jewish children still attending German schools. The German government announced laws that enforced Aryanization policy, the transfer of Jewish-owned enterprises and property to the Aryan ownership. The events of Kristallnacht represented one of the most important turning points in Nazi anti-Semitic policy. The Nazi regime moved eventually towards policies of forced immigration and finally toward the realization of a Germany free of Jews by deportation of the Jewish population to the East. It is important to understand and remember these events. It is also important to honor those that lived and died during this destructive part of history. It's probably most critical that we teach the lessons so that it may never happen again.
Yeah. So let's just, that's a broad overview of what we're going to do. As we've mentioned, that was ostensibly started after a 17-year-old Polish Jew who lived in Paris shot a low-ranking diplomat, German diplomat, because his parents, who have been living in Germany since 1911, were transported back to Poland. The diplomat was Ernst von Rath, who died on November 9th, but this day was also significant because that's when the Nazis first made their push, their purge. in Munich, and therefore they chose the assassination and the Significance Day to make a pogrom, and that's what it was. So pogroms were more prevalent in Tsarist Russia in the late 1800s. There was a lot of disquiet there in Russia about the Tsar and the Romanovs and the poverty and the lack of equality, and instead of dealing with the issues, they allowed spasmodic pogroms, whereby for a number of days the populace could simply attack the Jews. The police and government officials just stood back and did nothing, and many lives were lost. The most significant ones, one of these pogroms actually occurred in Kishinev in, I think it was 1905, which that was a real game changer, because one thought there was a new century, people had become enlightened, and at that point the Jews realized that they do not have a home in Russia, and that precipitated immigration to Israel, Palestine, as it was called then, to the United States and other destinations. So in a similar sense, as we'll see, this also became a game changer. The pogrom occurred, and again, Germany, the war had not started. This is 1938. The war started a year later, and throughout Germany and Austria, Prussia, there was a systematic destruction of synagogues. 200, over 200, I think 71 were destroyed. 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses were looted. The Jews were murdered. And to add insult to injury, the Jewish communities were asked to pay for the damage. And please understand that the Jews living here in Germany and Austria are very much part of the culture. Most of them served in the army. There was, in the First World War, there were many Jewish officers, many Jewish citizens were decorated for their services to Germany and Austria. They're very much part, at least they thought, of society. Certainly many Jewish doctors, musicians all came out of that period, as well as successful businessmen. Reality came to a home as the Nazis slowly came to power in 1933, but this event was the game changer, where the synagogue, 267 synagogues were destroyed. The caliber of synagogues there were extraordinary. Again, they were part of the communities. Many Jews were affluent, and they built beautiful structures in both Germany and Austria, and over the next 48 hours, these were simply burnt to the ground. Local police, local firemen did not intervene. Ironically, there was only one synagogue that survived, the Staatstemple, the city synagogue in Vienna. I was actually born in Vienna, and I've been there. There was a rule by the Kaiser, Franz Joseph, who was Kaiser just up until the aftermath of the First World War. He was actually very benevolent to the Jews, allowed them to build synagogues, but they weren't allowed to be on public thoroughfares, only in the back streets. So one synagogue, which was the city synagogue, it's barely detectable, but the slide at the bottom, you can see the arches. It's actually part of the housing structure. As you go into it, it's a beautiful synagogue that remains. So they couldn't set that alight because it would have burnt the surrounding buildings. So that ironically ensured its survival. In Vienna in particular, for some reason, there were no synagogues rebuilt. There are 10,000 Jews in Vienna today. Most of the synagogues are just in apartments that have been gutted. There are two very large Jewish day schools there. In Germany, a number of these synagogues have been rebuilt. In the 1990s, two Christian architects actually found the original plans of the synagogues of Vienna, and they reconstructed them via a computer. And I've actually got the book. It's just amazing. So you see the facade, the internals, seating of the synagogues, and then how it was positioned pre-38 and what's there today. And today, in most cases, just apartment blocks have been put there to replace that. We'll play the testimony of two of the survivors of the period who can best describe what went on there. Yes.
Remember exactly what day it was, but we woke up in the mornings and ready to go to school. I left with that Mrs. Bamberger, and we saw our synagogue on fire, the smoke coming out. And then we turned on the radio, and we heard the news that most of the synagogues were on fire. And we shouldn't go out of the house. Jews should stay in the house, don't go outside. And that's what we did. We stayed out inside. And then came around mid-morning, it wasn't noon yet, and mid-morning came a horde of people to the door and didn't ring the bell, just smashed the door down, came in with scissors and all kinds of instruments and just demolished the whole apartment. I remember she had a beautiful library, a whole wall of beautiful books, and they found the books, some of them they tore apart. All the dishes out of the cupboards were smashed, all the plants were turned over, pillows and things were cut up. It was just terrible. And they went from, that was a mostly Jewish occupied home there, and they went from door to door and did the same thing in the whole house. Well, I can't even describe anymore what our feelings were. We were just sitting there looking at a mess. How do you clean up? How do you do? How do you go out and buy new stuff? It was terrible, terrible. So the school was closed, the teachers were arrested, and so I went home to my hometown. And when I came to my hometown, the windows were smashed in again, and that was already a few days later. So my mother told me that my father was arrested, and under the circumstances which he was arrested, he tried to hide in the attic, and a policeman came and said, "Look, I have to bring in a body. If he doesn't come, I have to take you into custody." So my father gave himself up, and he was sent to Buchenwald. He was in Buchenwald for 4 weeks and was dismissed because he was a World War I veteran, fighting for the German army, with the German army. And the dismissal was under the condition that he would leave the country right away. I didn't see my father when he came back from Buchenwald. I saw him a few weeks later, and he was there for 4 weeks in Buchenwald. And when I saw him again, he told my mother, "We have to get out of here. No matter what, we have to get out. No matter wherever we can find a place to go, we gotta go." So, well, where do you go? So what happened? He took a little suitcase, and it became known that people smuggled people over the borders to Belgium, Holland, etc. So he went to the western part of Germany, and somebody took him over the border to Belgium, only with a little suitcase in his hand. All the assets were confiscated. We didn't have any control over our assets anymore. Bank books, everything has to be, well, they knew already what you had. I mean, they knew. But you had no control. It was called a Sperrkonto, and everything, only so much money you got every month to live off. That's it. You had to give up all your jewelry. Was confiscated. You could only keep your wedding ring and a watch. That's all. Everything else was confiscated. And also a big payment had to be made as punishment for Kristallnacht. You know, people had to repair their own, the damage that was done. They had to repair from their own pockets. And on top of it, I don't know how many millions of dollars, marks at that time, had to be paid to the government as punishment. At that time, my mother and one more family were the only Jewish people left in that little town. And we had a dentist there who was our dentist actually, but became a very, very big official Nazi in the party. And he wanted our property very badly. And when the war broke out in 1939, I think he hired a few people and they just took my mother out and beat her up. And she had no choice, she had to leave. We have to be aware of what's happening around us. We have to be alert and really, I don't think anything like this can happen again. I cannot believe it. I can't believe it. I have to tell the people what happened so they know it shouldn't happen again. It should never happen again, something like that. Be aware of your neighbors, be aware of what's happening around you. It's terrible when you live under dictatorship, awful. Even if you're not discriminated against, any dictatorship is terrible.
Sobering words. So, just to understand, there was method in their madness. They destroyed the houses of worship to say that we do not want you or your God here in the New Germany. They destroyed their businesses to say that there is no economic future here. But perhaps, and this is just, I'm actually doing a course at the Holocaust Museum here in Melbourne, and the lecturer actually highlighted what has been underestimated is the home invasions that occurred then. And to be clear, these home invasions weren't just for looting, were simply, our home is our most sacred place. And that's where we feel at home. That's where we feel relaxed. That's where we close up the outside world. And here, by invading their homes to send this message that even your most sacred space is not safe here. And they went into homes and just looted them and destroyed them for no other reason than simply to destroy them. They just tore bed covers apart. They tore down china cabinets and bookshelves just to show there was nothing safe here. The parallel, quite frankly, is stark in terms of what these evil people did on October 7th. Hamas, they went into homes, violated people in their own homes, and then destroyed their homes. I mean, the message is the same. We do not want you here. Nothing is safe and nothing is sacred. They followed the exact game plan. Those of us who may recall when the Israelis evacuated Gaza, I think in 2003, the first things they did was they destroyed the existing synagogues, the beautiful structures. They could have used it for something else. And then they also, the Israelis had built up an incredible industry there of hydroponic plants, and they immediately destroyed that as well to say, we want nothing to do with you as people. The other aspect here was particularly in Vienna and Berlin, there was the humiliation of Jews who were put in the public square, many of them asked to do humiliating tasks of scrubbing the streets. In Vienna, they've actually slowly the Viennese have come to terms with what they did, because for many years they claimed they were victims. They've got a statue of a woman scrubbing the street, and just as recently as 2 years ago, they finally put up a wall of the Austrian Jews, Viennese Jews who were killed by the Nazis as a memorial wall, and there they said we were admitting that they were responsible for this. What happened there as well, that 30,000 men were arrested and put in camps. They were there in most cases just for a month. They were beat up. Many died there, but it was really a foreshadow of what was to come in the future. Most of these people who were arrested then, because mind you, this is still 1938, eventually left on condition. They were allowed to, they would emigrate from Germany and Austria. And again, having said that, where does one go? Where does one go? Their money was confiscated. America closed its gates. I know Donna's host here. She's highlighted the incredible work of Ambassador Ho, China's Ambassador Ho, who issued thousands of visas. Donna's actually made a film about his heroic efforts of saving Jews, and there were a number of others, ambassadors at that time, Raoul Wallenberg and Ambassador of Japan, Zagahuti, in Vilna, I think he was, that issued visas. There was most countries at that time had quotas for immigration, and there was nowhere to go. So Shanghai had an open immigration policies because that provided that opportunity. Even Palestine at that time, one of the great betrayals of the Jewish people was by the British. Notwithstanding, there was a Balfour Declaration that they recognized Palestine as a homeland. They put quotas on that as well. So the Austrian and German Jews, many did have that opportunity to emigrate. I think, roughly speaking, 60% of them did, and 40% died in the camps. Just one final reflection here.
At 9 o'clock, my father said, "I told you, nothing is going to happen. I'm going to sleep." He went upstairs. And my mother and I sat in the living room, and I looked at for the last time, at a huge grandfather clock, and it struck. And at that moment, it sounded like a bomb fell on the house. There was such a terrific noise, and of course now I know what it was. We had iron shades on the outside of every window. There were 30 SR. Do you know what SR? But not in uniform. They all wore civilian clothes, but we knew them.
How did you know what they were?
Because some of them were from the village, and the rest were strangers. But when we saw the ones from the village, of course, we knew then. They had axes, and again, it was my mother who said afterwards, these axes had brand new handles, so it was prepared, because Dr. Goebbels got on the radio the next day and said, this was totally unprepared. We had nothing to do with it. The people did it. And my mother said, brand new handles for the... Anyhow, they actually hit through those iron shades everywhere. And then they broke down huge wooden front doors, and they came in. And my father came downstairs. He had put on pants over his nightshirt, and somehow I can see ourselves, the three of us, standing in the hallway against the wall. I stood on the first step upstairs, then my mother, then my father, and they came by us and started in the kitchen. Everything was demolished, broken, with the axes. There was no window left.
You see, as you can see, the purpose was simply to destroy the home. I'm sure they certainly beat up some people as well. And this is, again, your most sacred space. There's no room for you here. Hamas did the same thing after violating the people, actually burnt down the homes. And the challenge for Israel continues to this day, that in many cases they've got piles of ashes there. And they've actually, and I just read this morning, they've brought in archaeologists to go through the remains of the ashes to determine if there are actually human remains there. And daily they're finding more and more people's remains there that they thought were perhaps taken by Hamas, but were actually killed and then burnt just to ashes. Whilst America at that time, President Roosevelt, came out against the massacre, his famous words, he could scarcely believe that such thing could occur in a 20th century civilization. That was in 1938. I mean, it's happened again, hasn't it? But at the end of the day, in terms of assisting passage of Jews to emigrate, the only thing he did was there were currently 12,000 Germans, most of them Jews, in the United Nations on a tourist visa, visitor visas. He allowed them to stay, but the gates of immigration were closed. In the early part of the century, the early 1900s, America, when the pogroms occurred in Russia at that time, the gates of America were opened, and that allowed nearly 1 million Jews to immigrate to America at that time, and to Palestine. The waves of immigration began to start, and that was the beginning of American Jewry. But in the mid-century, most countries had closed their doors to immigration. Certainly one of the most difficult and challenging stories of that time was the famous story of the St. Louis. This was a turning point, and at the time, one of the Los Angeles papers ran a headline: "Nazis warn world Jewry will be wiped out unless evacuated by the democracies." And the gates for Jews at that time were not open. The Nazis also saw how complicit the German population were in what occurred on Kristallnacht. The photos of people just standing there as synagogues were burnt, as shops, Jewish shops where they regularly shopped were broken, looted, and they were thrown out. Neighbors who they'd been friends with for years, their homes had been violated. There was no protest, and this emboldened the Nazis just to expand and radicalize their measures to remove Jews entirely from German economic and social life in the forthcoming years, and that Germany should be a Judenrein. So part of the measures were that on the passports, every Jewish person had to have a J. As you can see the lady at the top, there were park benches for Jews and not for Juden. The shops were expropriated. Major shops were just taken over by the Germans. Their bank accounts were confiscated. It was just an outright looting of Jewish assets of Germany and Austria. There was a whole separate chapter of the works of art that were held by Jews were looted and confiscated. The Germans had a special division for that as well. Children were no longer allowed to go to German schools, universities, and even German, they weren't allowed to go to theaters or movies, cinemas or concerts. So the message was clear. We don't want you here. They were unable to participate in any type of life, and please leave. But the question was obviously where to go. So just to end on a positive note, so one of the famous, so we'll just share with you Pastor Martin Niemöller, who was a Protestant pastor there in Germany, his story, and also locally we'll share the very brave story of William Cooper, who, an Aboriginal here in Melbourne, went to the German embassy to deliver a letter of protest, the only personal letter of protest that was registered at that time. Evil survives, prospers when good men are silent. And I don't have to tell you, you've seen what's happened around the world with massive demonstrations by Muslims, pro-Palestinians, and others. The toxic environment on university campuses and here particularly in Sydney, the outrages that were said there in front of the Opera House. One of the bravest stances at that time was by William Cooper, who tried to deliver a message to the embassy. He was a religious Christian, and just there's a brief extract of his story here.
On the night of November 9th, 1938, Nazi soldiers looted and destroyed Jewish homes, businesses and synagogues throughout Germany. It became known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, and is seen by historians as the beginning of the Holocaust. A few weeks later, and 10,000 miles away, William Cooper, an Aboriginal from the Yorta Yorta people, led a protest through the streets of Melbourne to the German consulate to protest the cruel persecution of the Jewish people by the Nazi government of Germany.
Grandfather grew up in hard times. He knew how his people were treated and saw how they were treated. And when he saw something in the paper about Kristallnacht, he could see no one else was going to do anything about it. And he said to himself, well, I've got to do it. And he organised a march, mainly Aboriginal people. There was some white people with them, and marched on the German ambassador.
It was the only private protest to occur anywhere in the world. At the age of 14, Cooper was brought to an Aboriginal mission in Maloga, where he quickly learned to read and write. It was also where he became a Christian, declaring, "I must give my heart to God." In 1935, he helped establish the Australian Aborigines League and organised a petition to King George V that Aborigines have representation in the federal parliament and be adequately cared for. The government of Joseph Lyons declined to send it to King George, saying no useful purpose would be served by it. In response to this rejection, on the 150th anniversary of the arrival of the First Fleet, Cooper helped organise a national day of mourning. The day was supported by many churches around the country. Cooper saw very little progress in his lifetime. His protests to the government were ignored, his petition to Germany was rejected, and he never lived to see the 1967 referendum on Indigenous voting rights. In 1940, he said, "I am still fighting on, and though disheartened at times, I know God sees all, and that if we keep trusting Him, He will see that we get justice. And so I keep on going, and shall do to the end." But history would ultimately side with Cooper. The day of mourning Cooper established became what we know and celebrate today as NAIDOC Week. The federal division of Batman, named after a controversial early settler who massacred Aborigines, will be renamed Cooper for the next federal election. And William Cooper's example inspired countless people to continue his cause into the present day.
What he did for his own people, I think the benefits of what he did we can see around today. And I think people always will remember my grandfather for that.
In 2017, his grandson reenacted Cooper's Kristallnacht protest, delivering the same message to the German ambassador. This time, it was accepted.
Okay, on that note, we'll finish. It was actually heartwarming last night. We had here at the synagogue an impromptu, just sent it out a few days before, Liberal Friends of Israel. And I think nearly over 150 people attended. All of them, majority of them actually were Christian people. And one of the, funny's not the right word, one of the lady gets up at the end and said, "Look, everybody's saying here that the core message is the Jews have no right to the land of Israel, and you were never there. It was given to you by the Holocaust." And I said, "I just want to remind you, every year on December 25th, we celebrate the birthday of a very famous Jew. He's called Jesus, and he was born in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago." So on that note, perhaps David, just turn off the recording. And actually, Maxine, I